Throughout the 1920s, Dell publications served as the industry standard on print media. Led by a syndicated series of newspaper strips called Famous Funnies, these publications were the go-to source for comedy, satire, and adventure. But a new age was emerging, one which would force Dell publications out of the limelight as a competitor emerged, with a flagship character that would change print media forever. With Superman established as the preeminent superhero following his introduction in Action Comics issue number 1 in 1938, in his first appearances, Superman's powers were largely simple. Because pulp comics predated Superman's arrival by serving as a popular source of fictional stories in the 1920s and the 1930s, ranging from detective works to heroics, while characters like Doc Savage, the Shadow, and the Phantom Detective lacked any kind of superpowers in the traditional sense, their popularity was largely rooted in the fact that they fought crime using their personal attributes, including a photographic memory, martial arts, as well as their intelligence. Where the goal of Siegel and Shuster was to move heroes into a new echelon by introducing powers, a balance had to be maintained by changing things enough that Superman would invoke interest, but not so much that he seemed too far-fetched in the eyes of prospective fans. To this end, with his original introduction, Siegel and Shuster established that Superman's powers were a byproduct of his alien physiology, and as a result, the Man of Steel could leap 1/8 of a mile, or the length of 2 football fields, lift tremendous weights, run faster than an express train, and withstand artillery at point-blank range. However, with the introduction of Superman came creations from other publication companies like Fawcett Comics, who were looking to capitalize on and replace Superman with their own heroes like Captain Marvel. In response, DC found itself swept up in a maelstrom of frenzied attempts to keep Superman on par with his competitors, some of whom had already demonstrated the power of flight. And so in Action Comics issue number 8, Superman was demonstrated as being able to outrace a speeding bullet for the very first time. In Action Comics issue number 11, he was provided with X-ray vision allowing him to see through walls, as well as super hearing, which provided him with the ability to spy on and eliminate criminal activities. And in Action Comics issue number 20, he was demonstrated as having super breath, which allowed him to knock over individuals who intended harm to themselves or others. While these powers were largely introduced within the context of the story and made Superman virtually indestructible and incredibly powerful in comparison to the technology of the time, these abilities also left the Man of Steel open to the possibility of expanding his powers, something that saw fruition under Fleischer Studios in 1941 with their introduction of 8 short-length Superman features.
Up in the sky, look!
It's a bird!
It's a plane! It's Superman!
As a now-defunct animation company based out of New York and formed by Max and David Fleischer, it was during the creation of these films that Superman would first gain the power of flight. Having been contacted by its parent company, Paramount Pictures, for the purpose of creating a series of animated shorts based on the newly created Superman, but in the midst of a project titled Mr. Bug Goes to Town, the goal of the Fleischer brothers was to keep their workload simple and to focus on only one film at a time in order to ensure quality over quantity. However, because Paramount was the parent company and served to finance the Fleischer's projects, the idea was to effectively turn down the request without damaging the contract between the two. To this end, the Fleischers quoted Paramount an outrageous price of $100,000 per episode, which was 4 times higher than the $25,000 cost of producing other animations of the time, like Popeye the Sailor. Furthermore, once Paramount had negotiated the price down to $50,000, the Fleischers found that the depiction of Superman leaping 1/8 of a mile seemed silly given the high quality of the animated features and the fact that by Whiz Comics issue number 5, Captain Marvel had already demonstrated the ability to fly. And so after contacting DC Comics, the Fleischers were granted approval to remove the ability to leap distances and replace it with the power of flight. With fans relishing in both the idea that Superman could fly, as well as the increased sense of urgency that could be created from his races to save Lois Lane with only moments to spare, this concept was rolled over into the comic books, and by Action Comics issue number 123 in 1948, flight was officially added to Superman's repertoire as an enhancement to his ability to leap incredible distances. However, with the ever-increasing expanse of his powers in offhanded ways based on particular stories, the problems faced by fans was that some powers remained while others were removed. This was compounded on following the end of World War II, when the idea of the late 1940s to the late 1950s saw Superman thrown into the realm of science fiction. Because alien invaders and creatures from space were increasing in popularity with the introduction of shows like 1951's Tales of Tomorrow, a spiritual predecessor to The Twilight Zone, the stories of Superman were adjusted to include the use of science fiction concepts. Furthermore, in addition to the need for DC to create new material in order to keep up with competitors like Captain Marvel from Fawcett Comics, whose powers were continually being expanded on to keep up with and overshadow Superman, DC was also facing a crisis following the departure of Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster in 1947. As a byproduct of a lengthy legal battle over the rights to Superman, without Siegel and Shuster to continue the trend of overseeing the expansion of Superman's character and stories, the duties of editor were turned over to Mort Weisinger. While Weisinger had worked with DC Comics in the early 1940s and was instrumental in creating characters like Aquaman and Green Arrow, with the departure of Siegel and Shuster, his attention was now turned to remodeling their creation by elevating the powers of Superman, and in doing so, establish a self-contained world along with a super family. To this end, where the era of 1948 to 1958 is largely referred to as the Lost Decade, in that many of the stories were considered silly and largely ignored, with Mort Weisinger taking over control as editor in 1958, Superman began to see massive expansions to his powers. In Superman Volume 1, issue number 146 in 1961, Weisinger consolidated all of the information regarding Superman's powers as well as the basis behind them, eliminated what he didn't want, and kept what he considered to be material that would create for more compelling stories and serve his ultimate goal. Considered by many comic book historians to be a soft reboot of sorts for the Man of Steel's powers, Weisinger established that Superman had incredible strength, a physical body and clothing that could not be harmed by any weapon on the face of the earth, including atomic bombs, X-ray vision that could see through walls and melt steel, and that he operated as a servant of the common man and protector of the earth. Furthermore, Superman's flight had always been an aspect of his powers, and that as a baby, his flight would manifest itself, but he had no control of it. To achieve control over this ability to fly, during his teenage years as Superboy, Jonathan Kent had helped him to master his control over flying in a similar capacity to learning how to ride a bike with training wheels. And so with these powers established, Weisinger took the next step of forming their basis by stating that the extreme gravity on Krypton caused the muscles of Kryptonians to become extremely dense, and that when Superman arrived on Earth, by default, the lighter gravity of Earth allowed for super speed, reflexes strength, and invulnerability. In addition to this, because Krypton had a red sun, instead of the sun's suppressing abilities, it simply didn't activate the portion of the brain that allowed for powers. On the other hand, the yellow sun of Earth energized this portion of the brain and awakened Superman's powers of X-ray vision, telescopic vision, and the like. And so following this consolidation, between 1960 and 1970, Superman's powers were expanded on within the context of stories and based largely on the situation itself rather than the practicality of the power in question. As a result, fans were met with a series of increasingly ridiculous displays of powers, like 1961's Action Comics issue number 273, where Superman sneezed a galaxy out of existence, and 1967's Superboy issue number 120, where he pulled a chain of planets out of a dying galaxy. While some of these abilities were only featured once and never seen again, DC had taken no steps to retcon these powers, meaning that over the course of his lifetime leading up to the conclusion of the Silver Age, Superman had amassed the powers of time travel, invulnerability, faster than light travel, super speed, hearing, and strength, as well as telepathy, telekinesis, heat vision, hypnosis, among others. And so by 1970, with Krypto the dog, Supergirl, Superboy, and the rest of the Super family in existence, all of whom possessed the same level of strength and powers of Superman, Weisinger retired from DC Comics, and in his place came Julius Schwartz. As a protagonist and firm believer in the practical nature of powers rather than the godlike displays of Superman's stories under Weisinger, Schwartz believed that Superman's powers had systematically destroyed the ability for Schwartz and his team to create compelling stories, and in turn, sought to return the Man of Steel to his Golden Age roots by reducing his powers to 1/3 of what they had been during the 1960s. With Superman issue number 233, Julius Schwartz initiated a series commonly referred to as the Sandman Saga. In the events of this story, a scientist had been attempting to power a machine using the energy of kryptonite, but when the experiment went awry, all kryptonite on Earth was rendered inert and had no effect on Superman. Continuing the trend of retconning the Man of Steel, Julius Schwartz introduced the Sand Superman. As a byproduct of the experimental failure and the elimination of kryptonite, a portal was formed between Earth and the Quorum Dimension. While only appearing for the sake of this story, a fraction of the Quorum Dimension's psychic energy manifested on Earth where it took on the form of a sand version of Superman. Draining power from the Man of Steel each time Superman engaged in battle, but looking to take on the role of a superhero, at the conclusion of the story, the two came to the realization that Sand Superman consisted of negatively charged energy, while Superman consisted of positively charged energy, and that if the two were to touch, it would start a chain reaction that would destroy the Earth. Engaged in a stalemate, the Sand Superman made the decision to return to his own dimension, with Superman refusing to have his vast powers returned to him. As a result, while he maintained most of his prominent abilities, the powers of hypnosis, time travel, and the like were removed, leaving him with powers similar to his Golden Age form. While the intention of Julius Schwartz was rooted in a desire to make Superman more relatable, for fans, Superman was a larger-than-life hero, and his role in the DC universe had to reflect that. And so within one issue of the Sandman Saga's completion, Julius Schwartz was removed from the title, and in the publications leading up to Crisis on Infinite Earths, Superman's Silver Age powers were slowly restored.